This Chinese folk tale is called simply The Woodcutter. This woodcutter would go off alone in a forest where few humans did otherwise. He worked long, he worked hard, he prospered, his arms grew much more muscular than these, and he came to know that forest especially well, in particular, the wild creatures, the birds, and the animals within it. But on this particular day, as he was preparing to bring his wares back to town, he heard a bird cry that he had never heard or heard of. That was an easy sound to remember, and he followed it where he heard it and found soon that he'd come to an old little cage, a trap that included a cage cunningly fashioned from bamboo. And he saw two strange white-feathered birds fluttering madly within it. And he thought, oh, whoever's trapped you here will kill you for sure. Looking carefully around, he undid the catch and set them free. Watched them flutter away, and joy lifted in his heart, and he went on to his work, and that day and many, many other days, until at last he grew prosperous enough and old enough to leave off woodcutting and move to a town many miles away to be near his sons who had moved on to other work in the cities. But he found pottering in the garden, being with his family, wonderful though they were, left one hole in his heart. And one day he said to his wife, "My dear, I have to see that forest again. It has been so long, and I wonder what of my animal friends are still there now." And so she packed some of his favorite things to eat. And he took out his walking stick and made the long journey over the range of hills and into that forest, and spent a happy day reacquainting himself with many old friends and many old sounds and smells and sights, traveling always toward the farther edge of the wood. But as he came over a rise late in the day, during the golden hour, it became clear that this forest had grown a great deal. For not only did he not reach the end of it, he did not see the end of the woods. It seemed to stretch on and on and on. But since it was far too late to turn back and hope of getting out of the forest that way before night fell, he pushed on with redoubled speed. But when at last the light failed and he was still no nearer the end of the forest, it seemed, the only thing he could think to do was to find a great old tree with a trunk that came out into two parts, almost like a hollow tree, and shelter himself in the division as best he could. There was no rain, although he'd eaten his food, and as he tried to go to sleep, it seemed his eyes were playing a trick on him, because he thought he saw a light, where he had not a moment ago, and he stood up and looked at it and followed that light to the front of a small wooden house, surrounded by great trees. He thought, well, knock on the door and asked for hospitality, and the door opened, and in the doorway there stood a very, very, very tall woman with long, pale gray hair, wearing a long gown as red as blood. She said nothing. "Pardon me, good lady." I had to look up at her, she was so tall. "I am trapped in this forest tonight. Might I perhaps have some shelter and hospitality, and so that I may find my way tomorrow?" "Come inside," she said, swaying slightly. As he entered the room, she prepared a soup for him, a large bowl, very nourishing, but she ate nothing herself and said nothing herself. And as he said, "Well, I don't see a bed. Perhaps there's a place I could lie down?" She stood up, and the gown fell, and beneath her head there was an enormous set of scales. She was a snake from her neck down to the floor. And what coils they were uncoiled, until now she was not merely tall, she towered over him almost from the ceiling. "You don't remember me. You remember the birds you set free years and years ago from my cage. Those were my birds. And you are going to die tonight, little thief. And she opened her mouth and she showed her little white fangs. And she curved toward him and he backed away and said, please, in every story I've ever known, there's always a way, some service I could do, some way to earn your forgiveness. Her eyes did not blink. There is one thing. You must find a temple within this forest, an ancient temple, and you must find a great bell, and you must ring it 12 times before the 12th hour of the night. Gladly, I'll do it at once. And he moved toward the door, but she did not make way for him. Instead, she said, you may not leave this house. Not all night? Then how can I ring the bell? That is your problem. And her mouth stayed open like that, showing her fangs. And he looked for a trick. He looked for an escape, a window. There were none. A trap door, a secret door. At last he began to think of wilder thoughts. Is there a bell in here? Is this some sort of, not temple, it's not really a temple the way philosophers would call it. Is there perhaps a tiny temple in the middle of the cottage that's still in the forest? He riddled her, thinking perhaps she might explain. She coiled down upon her scales. She closed one eye as if to rest, but the other eye looked at him and did not blink as the hours wore on. And when midnight came, well, he knew it must be close, only because she began to uncoil again and unwind until she towered above him, head almost to the ceiling, opened the other eye and leaned toward him, showing those teeth. Gong, 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 gong. There was no mistaking the bell sound, but from where? Gong, 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 gong. There seemed to be a sort of a mist, a haze rising and covering everything he saw. Gong, 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 gong. And at the 12th ring, there was no snake woman, there was no house, there were no foundations. He stood alone in the midnight forest. But that last note reverberated so that he could now sense what direction it came from. And through the trees he pushed. In his haste, stumbling over a root here and there, lucky not to dash himself against a tree. And looking around, he found, after a long search, some old great stones that could not be moved, but that might be the top of a half-buried temple. And he dug with his stick and with his hands, found a door that he could push open. And as the moon had now risen, he could see very faintly the outline of an enormous bell. And even more faintly, traces of blood dripping from the edge of it, and a mass of white feathers beneath. The feathers of the 2 birds that had dashed themselves against the bell to save his life. He gathered them, he fed them, he gave them water. He kept them very still so they could not injure themselves. He stayed, hungry though he was, for 3 days near that old temple until they began to stir of their own accord, their wounds seeming to heal. They tried hesitantly at first, and then joyously to fly. Up past the trees, never to be seen again. That is the story they tell of the woodcutter.